Hello, a very warm good morning to all of you and welcome to BYJU'S Exam Prep. Welcome to today's the Hindu Newspaper Analysis, where today we shall be analyzing the newspaper, the Hindu Newspaper of 17th March 2023, and we shall be taking up the Delhi edition of the newspaper for the analysis purposes. So we shall be holding the discussions for certain articles for the mains perspective, certain articles which are relevant for your prelims perspective only, given the fact that the prelims examination is approaching. So that is something that we shall be discussing only for the prelims perspective. And at the end of it, we shall be discussing a couple of subjective types of questions which can be framed out of these topics. Wherever possible, we shall try to make it interactive and answer a couple of questions in the meanwhile. Now, what I would suggest to you is that after the session, please do try the multiple choice questions which are uploaded on our Telegram channel, and thereby you can assess your level of understanding for all of these topics. The link is provided in the description below. Now, let us take a look at the topics which have appeared, which are relevant and important for discussion. So first of all, we shall be starting the discussion from the page of the editorial, that is, the colonial past is still relevant. Now, this is an article or a piece which has been written by Shashi Tharoor, and it talks about the impacts of colonial history, which many countries of the world, they still end up facing. So this is something which is going to be relevant for your paper 1. Okay? With regards to post-colonial activities and impacts that you see in the form of governance structures, in the form of the socio-political impact that the various countries face, that is something we are going to analyze there. Then after that, we are going to discuss tested but tired. This force could be in distress. This is a particular article which has been written keeping in mind the Central Allied Forces, that is, in this case, it has been written keeping in mind the CRPF, because recently the Remembrance Day for Pulwama attack passed in the last month, and that is where this article comes from. So this is going to be again important for your paper 3. And UPSC has always and multiple times asked a question with regards to what kinds of reforms need to be done in the paramilitary forces. Why is it that the paramilitary forces are not effective? So that is something we will address there. Then testing times. This is with regards to the shrinking of exports that we are experiencing, that we in India have experienced in the past month, and why that is happening. That is something we shall try to analyze. Again, relevant for your paper 3. And then, Japan-South Korea renew relations. This is a kind of a landmark event and an achievement, so to say, in the region of the Pacific, where two major powers of the region of the Pacific, they have started the process to mend their relations, which have been frosty for a very, very long time. So this is going to be important for your paper 2. After that, we shall be discussing few of the topics relevant for your prelims perspective. For example, National Institute of Ocean Technology, that has set up a desalination plant. So what that desalination plant is, what is the technology used, we shall mention it and focus on it very, very briefly. And after that, Navy deploys its P-8I aircraft in the exercise which is being held in Guam. Where is Guam? In the region of Pacific. And what is this exercise called? Again, relevant for your prelims perspective. Then, the Zojila Tunnel has been opened up after being shut down during the winter. And there we shall be looking at what this Zojila Tunnel is and why it is important. So those are the topics that we are going to discuss today. So without further ado, let us straight away jump into the discussion and let us pick up the first topic of the day. So this is something which has appeared in page 8 of the Delhi edition. And here, the article says the colonial past is still relevant. Now here, when we talk about colonial past, I hope we all understand what do we mean by that. But nonetheless, We had an era, an entire century or more of a period whereby various different powers, especially the European powers, they would exert their political, administrative, and military control in various different nations. That would lead to exploitation of the masses and a kind of a colonial rule whereby the masses would be governed by the British Crown, as was the case with India, or by the various different sovereignties like Belgium, Italy, and so on. At one point of time, you had a scenario where almost 2/3 of the world was under the spate of colonial power. So that is where this colonial or the colonialization, as it is referred to, that has left its lasting mark. Now, even though nowadays you don't find the existence of such practices being prevalent or being present in various parts of the world, but nonetheless, if we take a look at the societies, if we take a look at the governance structures, if we take a look at the social divisions which exist in many parts of the world, be it Africa, be it Asia, even in the case of Latin America, many of these are a direct outcome of the colonial past of these countries. So that is what this article talks about. So if we take a look at the context which has been set up for this article, so basically the subject of colonial rule and the colonial power, even though it no longer occupies the major public imagination or the public discourse. And that is where you don't find the conversations happening even in the domestic audience or even amongst the international audience. You don't find that discussion happening that why colonialism was bad or what are the impacts that are left behind by colonialism. So obviously, this is a kind of a thing which is fading out of the memory of the common populace or the large mass slowly, one at a time. Now here, the impact of colonialism, as we have said, is still being felt, and it remains a relevant factor in understanding the problems that many of the countries they face, especially when you talk about few of the very complicated and complex issues with regards to ethnic clashes, with regards to religious divide, with regards to ethnic minorities and majorities trying to go at each other. So that is where the colonial rule has left its imprint. So let us analyze it. Let us try to analyze the impacts which have been left as has been dictated by this article. Now here, when we take a look at the direct impacts which have been felt by the various different regions of the world, one has to be very clear in the mindset that in majority of the cases, the colonial powers, they departed suddenly, or in a kind of a rushed decision, they made a kind of an untidy departure. What is an untidy departure? Where even though you are ruling that region for maybe 100 years or more, but at the time of leaving, you do not put in systems in place. You do not ensure a peaceful transition of power. You do not ensure plans for peace. And that is a kind of an untidy departure. If you tickle your recent memory, you will find the same situation which was emergent in the case of the departure of forces even from Afghanistan. You would have observed the kind of chaos that Afghanistan was plunged into. Now, that is not exactly a definition of colonialism, what happened in the case of Afghanistan recently, but something on a similar scale has been experienced in the past century by almost all the countries of the world who suffered at the hands of these colonial powers. And nowhere more so can we feel the effect of it as in our own subcontinent, that is in the region around India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Nepal, Bhutan, Tibet, and so on. So here, when we take a look at the subcontinent, impact that it has created on the subcontinent, and how there was a hastened, untidy departure which these colonial powers, they instigated. So here, just take the case of our borders. Now, we know, and yesterday in the news we had discussed about the Radcliffe line. Remember, Radcliffe line is the line which delineates the border between Arunachal Pradesh and Tibet, right? So we had seen the Radcliffe line. Now this Radcliffe line, or not exactly the Radcliffe line, apologies for this. So that is the McMahon line. McMahon line. This McMahon line basically delineates the boundary between Arunachal and Tibet. And basically, India has been posturing to China, India has been requesting to China for a very long period of time to adopt this McMahon line as the international border. But then China doesn't agree to it. Due to this level of disagreement which prevailed after the departure of the British, now the Britishers, they simply drew this line, the McMahon line, based upon a simple treaty which they concluded with the representatives of Tibet way back in 1914. And that treaty which they concluded in 1914, they did not even ensure that the transitionary powers or the powers who are going to succeed the Britishers in the subcontinent, are they okay with that agreement or not? And it is that particular point due to which China is not ready to agree to the realities of McMahon line. China doesn't recognize McMahon line in general. Now, if you take a look at the ground realities, you'll be surprised to know that even this McMahon line, how it has been drawn on paper, when you translate it onto the ground, this line translates into a width of 8 kilometers on the ground. Just imagine. So, width of 8 kilometers. Especially around the region of Sundarongshu, that is around the Tawang frontier and so on, this line has got a width of 8 kilometers. So let's suppose tomorrow, both the nations, that is India and China, both of them agree that, okay, McMahon line is the international border. But that also leaves so much amount of scope for interpretation, and interpretation in your own way. If you have a line or a border which is 8 kilometers wide, then that means there will be incursions which shall happen from both sides. This is the reason why we have varying perspectives with regards to border. Now, take the case of our other side, the border on our western frontier. Now there we have the Radcliffe line. Now this Radcliffe line was basically drawn on a map by Cyril Radcliffe, who was a lawyer, who was a part of the boundary commission which was set by the British. Now interestingly, Cyril Radcliffe had never come to India before drawing that line. And he simply drew that line regardless of the cultural ties, the traditional bondages which were present, the local customs which were present, regardless of the shared ancient history, that line was drawn. And because of that Radcliffe line, which now separates India and Pakistan, which was drawn on the map, because of that, we have endured decades of hostile relationship. And that immediately triggered one of the major mass migrations in the history of mankind. And due to that mass migration, we had a situation where we lost more than a million of people during that process of migration. So imagine if that process of departure by the British, if it would not have been that hasty enough, probably there would have been time to sort these issues out, these nuances out. So that has not only been observed in India, by the way, and the Indian subcontinent. The impact is very much visible to us, and the impact is still very much felt by us on a day-to-day basis because of clashes which happen across the various different borders and various different areas which we think as international border, and the other side considers something else as international border. At the same time, this is something which has been felt in Afghanistan. Afghanistan, if you take a look at it, Afghanistan also suffered from a kind of a colonialism through the late 70s and the 80s as a result of Russian invasion in Afghanistan. Now, what ensued or what resulted was a United States-led pushback. As a result of that, Afghanistan was plunged in a civil war. And that is when the local militias, they gained power, and that slowly and steadily created a scenario by which Taliban could gain a kind of a legitimacy that we see even today. Same cases you will come across in the region of Myanmar, in many of the African nations, and this hasty departure has created lot of areas of contention. Take the case of Jammu and Kashmir, take the case of Palestine. And these issues, they rage till today. And the areas and the governments of the day, they are trying incredibly hard to normalize the conditions for the people living in these areas. Then, there has been reignition of conflicts in many of the African nations particularly. Why? Because, see, when you have a kind of a colonial past, thereby that colonial past impacts many of the countries. Let's say a particular country A, that is something which is ruling over B and also over C. Now, it might be possible that A has promised something to B, that this much territory is yours, and A has also promised to C that this much territory is yours. Now A suddenly decides to pack up his bags and go. What will happen to the promises? Now B will demand this, what was promised to B, and C will also demand what was promised to C. That is giving rise to many conflicts, many border issues in African nations. That is why if you take a look at the map of Africa, it looks very artificial because of the straight delineation of the boundaries which was done by these colonial powers. But then, one of the major impacts that these powers have left behind is a gaping social divide. And that social divide has been created by them. It is a kind of a poor understanding of society as you can attribute it to. For example, in the region of Rwanda and Burundi, you had the Belgian forces or the Belgian government and the sovereignty. They divided the people into Hutus and Tutsis. Now, it is because of this particular division, which did not, by the way, did not exist in that region before. It was created by the Belgian sovereignty. And as a result of that, Rwanda went through a terrible phase of civil war where you had mass killings and people killing each other on the streets of Kigali, and the entire Rwanda was ravaged because of this. They still suffer from it. Now, just because you had the condition that one of these groups were favored by the Belgian power, that is why the other group always saw them as anti-national, and that prevails till today. The same case you can see even in the situation of Sri Lanka. Now, Sri Lanka, after gaining independence, the local population, that is the local ethnic Sinhalese population, always had the mindset that the colonial powers, they were friendly with the Sri Lankan Tamils. And that created a kind of an impression that the Sri Lankan Tamils somehow, they are not nationalistic enough or they are not patriotic enough. And they are basically a sellout to the foreign powers. That is a kind of mindset created here as well. That is the kind of mindset created in Sri Lanka as well, due to which Sri Lanka was entangled in a very vicious civil war which claimed tens of thousands of lives and ravaged the entire country. Now, the concept of martial races, that in itself was brought in by these colonial powers. For example, after 1857, if you observe the British policy that they followed and they pursued, they significantly and single-mindedly followed a policy whereby they talked about the fact that now, in order to strengthen the army, let us include people from the martial races. Martial races indicating that those who are genetically a bit gifted. And that is where you had majority of people from the region of the present-day Punjab province of India, Punjab state, and the Punjab province of Pakistan. And that is where many of the Punjabis, they were taken in and inducted in the armed forces, a tradition which still continues today, and a tradition which has virtually emptied the coffers of our neighboring country to the west. Then, divide and rule policy, that in itself can simply be created and referred to as a handiwork of the colonial power, especially the British forces. Now, when they started conducting the census exercise in order to get an idea about the demography, about the population, at that point of time, early in the 1870s and so on, at that point of time, many of the people under the portion of religion, they did not even know what to write. But then slowly and steadily it was ingrained into the mindset of the society to such an extent that even the present day religious animosity that we suffer from in many parts of the subcontinent, that antagonistic feeling which still persists in the subcontinent, is a direct consequence of that divide and rule policy. So that is where the social divide, the caste divide, the class divide, everything was created as a consequence. You also had a kind of a political impact, a socio-political impact. And here, for example, when you have a mixed history where various different countries have ruled in that region, so there is a kind of a mixed interpretation with regards to what follows the sovereign area of that country or a territory of that country. Let's suppose a particular colonial power is ruling over a land like this. Now, that colonial power has left, another colonial power has come in, and they are ruling over a land which is this one. Now, when both of them leave, the newer area or the other area, they will always feel that we were never a part of the other country, and they will always have the secessionist tendency. So that is something which has been observed in the region of Yugoslavia as well, where in the portion of Yugoslavia, the erstwhile Yugoslavia, the earlier Yugoslavia, in that portion, you had many portions which were included, which traditionally for hundreds of years, they were under the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And in that same country, many areas were also included as a result of the post-colonial cleanup. Many areas were also included which were traditionally a part of the Ottoman Empire. So as a result of that, the new country which got created, they always had a difference of thought with regards to what constitutes our ethnic nation or our particular nation state. And that is why the entire nation crumbled and split. Now, there has always been a debate with regards to nationalism in all these nations where these colonial powers have left. That with regards to that what constitutes nationalism. That is a debate you won't find to be present in those particular countries which have not suffered from that colonial checkered past. All those countries which have suffered from this, there you will find this raging debate that who is more nationalistic, what is nationalism, what is patriotism. This is a persistent question which stands true or stands in front of the society. Boundaries which are drawn during those times, they still trigger conflicts as we have discussed. Old customs and social traditions, including cultural ties, including the socio-hierarchical structures, including the kind of structure or a relationship that you have within the cults, within the various different tribes, the tribal heads, the chiefs, all of them were dismantled. That has led to anarchy in many of the African nations in particular. And it has also led to the rise of civil wars in the region of Africa. The easiest cases you can see in the form of Rwanda. Now, this colonial past also has an impact in governance. And this is something that we don't realize. When we say impact in governance, even today, the countries which have had a colonial past, you will find all of them are under a grip of a massive underdevelopment. Immediately after the colonial powers left, all these countries were left scampering for resources, for food. Many people died out of abject poverty and starvation due to lack of food. But then, that underdevelopment has been carried on because of their very skewed developmental policies or the focused attention only on certain areas and a complete neglect on the rest of the political scenario or the rest of the public. Then, this has also fueled a cycle of inequalities in these nations. How? So, during the colonial period, you had the presence of, for example, when we consider infrastructure. infrastructure was something which had been developed only in certain areas, only for the certain affluent areas, and those areas generally housed the industries which would supply the raw materials or the other products required by these colonial powers. And after these countries they gained independence, or after these colonial powers departed, the facilities, the infrastructure, the social structure, everything was concentrated in those areas. And the people living in those areas, they already had the facilities, they already had enough amount of an advantage as compared to the rest of the population with regards to the choices in life. It is always about the choices that you are able to make, right? So as a result of that, you had a consequence, you had a scenario that these people, these affluent sections, they kept on developing. Whereas the rest of the portion of the country, that remained ignored. And that is the impact we feel still today, where the rich, they get richer, whereas the poor, they are stuck in the vicious cycle of poverty and they get poorer. So that is what this article talks about, and that is where we have dabbled in various portions of associated history and historical facts. Now, this is going to be relevant for your paper 1 from a subjective perspective, a mains question perspective. Then we move on to the second article. Before that, Rishabh, what is martial races? Martial races, see, the entire concept was brought in by the Britishers, which was also then significantly publicized during the Second World War era. So martial races, those races which are sturdy enough and meant to fight, they are supposed to have that kind of a genetic advantage. For example, the Pashtuns, during the British era, the Pashtuns were significantly preferred to be inducted in various different armed forces and armed battalions. And that was the same case with the people belonging from the erstwhile larger state of Punjab. They were preferred. And that is where still today in the region of Pakistan, if you will observe, you still have the same section of people being inducted in the military. Okay? Right. Durand Line is present in the region around Pakistan and Afghanistan. Impact on economy size, obviously that is there, Kishan, but then that many of the countries have started to come back, and that is where we talk about the issue of underdevelopment. And there is also the issue with regards to education. And few of the countries, for example, China and so on, they have been able to shed that past very quickly, whereas few of the countries, they are trying to get back to the modern methods together, carrying the traditions along with them. Now we come to the second topic, that is with regards to your portion of internal security, and that is tested but tired. This force could be in distress. So this article is again something which has appeared in page 8, relevant for your paper 3 of internal security, that is under the portion of paramilitary forces. So here, the context of this article is basically that the day of remembrance of the Pulwama attack that passed away last month, and the Pulwama attack which did happen in 2019, February of 2019, that claimed the lives of close to around 40 personnel of CRPF, India's largest paramilitary force. Now here, this article and this particular mention talks about CRPF being deployed in majority of the conflict areas in the country now. At one point of time, in majority of the areas which were under conflict, for example, the northeastern insurgency and so on, thereby you had the deployment of armed forces or army in that region. But now army is being withdrawn from many areas of northeastern states. Armed forces are being withdrawn from Jammu and Kashmir as well. Armed forces are withdrawn and being put down to their own barracks. So in these areas, to manage the situation, the CRPF and other paramilitary forces are being deployed in large numbers. Now why is it that first of all the army is being withdrawn? The army is being withdrawn for very straight reasons. it does not look good either for the country itself nor for the global audience. If you are aspiring to be the next superpower of the world, you cannot have a situation where you have your army deployed to maintain peace in the interior of the country. That is why, in order to manage the optics, and also the situation is smoothing out in most of the places. For example, when we talk about the major internal security challenges that India has faced for the past 3 to 4 decades, it can basically be finalized or categorized into 3 categories. So major challenges, if you will look at, what are the major challenges? One is insurgency in Northeast. Another is Maoism and Naxalism. And then you have the situation in Jammu and Kashmir. These are the areas where the country has been facing major internal security challenges for the past 3 to 4 decades taken cumulatively. Now the situation has improved almost on all these fronts. In fact, in the region of northeastern states, there you will find that infrastructure connectivity has happened, people are able to travel, people have better economic opportunities. So yes, there are certain grievances which still persist in certain small states, but then over on a larger situation, it is a completely different scenario as you compare it to the late 1980s or the early 1990s. Then in the case of, now it is in these northeastern states where for the first time Air Force was deployed in order to maintain and carry out peace in the region, in the interior of the country. So you can imagine how bad the situation was in the past. Then, in the case of the Naxals and the Naxalism, there also, by the way, the CRPF, the largest casualty that it has faced was way back in 2010 when you had 76 personnel who lost their life due to the Naxal attack. But now, over a period of time, over a decade and a half, this situation has also normalized. Now, then in Jammu and Kashmir also, as the situation normalizes, the army is being pulled back. And as a result of that, more and more CRPF personnel are deployed there. Now, these personnel who are deployed there, they are oftentimes overworked. And that is the case with majority of the paramilitary forces in India. By the way, when we say paramilitary forces, what do we mean by that? So these are not your direct Indian armed forces, Indian Air Force or your Indian Naval Force, but then when you take a look at it, you have these few paramilitary forces in India. For example, Assam Rifles, right? Assam Rifles is considered to be one of the oldest paramilitary forces established in the 1800s, and this is headed still by a Lieutenant General of the Indian Army. So operational control is with the Indian Army, but in the case of Assam Rifles, the administrative control is with the Ministry of Home Affairs. The operational control is under the Ministry of Defense. So think about it. Think about the process of management here. You have 2 ministries which take care of Assam Rifles. So obviously, there shall be inadequacies, inefficiencies, which will crop up along the way. Then the Border Security Force. Right? Now, this border security force are supposed to be the frontline protectors of majority of the international border which is present across the country. Then you have the CISF, which is responsible for security. So this is something which is deployed at international border. International border in many of the areas. Then CISF for your industries, for your airports, for VIP securities nowadays. So that is where CISF is deployed. It has got a separate unit taking care for VIP security, for the VIP guards. And then you have the ITBP, which is deployed at the heights of Arunachal Pradesh, Sikkim, Uttarakhand, Himachal Pradesh, and also in some parts of Ladakh. So it takes care of the China border. Then you have the National Security Guard, which is a kind of a specialized force, more or less, and you have the Sashastra Seema Bal. Sashastra Seema Bal, it takes care of the Indo-Nepal and the Indo-Bhutan borders. That is responsible for Indo-Nepal and Indo-Bhutan borders. So, these are the paramilitary forces which are present in India. Now, all these paramilitary forces, you will find that increasingly they are deployed in different theaters, different regions, and for different purposes. Now, just the cross deployment is never an issue. The issue that starts to persist is basically because of the overstretched work schedule that the people have to go through. Now, if you take a look at CRPF, for example, CRPF, for which the article has primarily been written and drafted, and CRPF, which is deployed in large numbers in Jammu and Kashmir nowadays. So this is something which has been formed and established by the enactment of CRPF Act 1949. This is a trivia relevant for your prelims. And initially, it was the Crown Representatives Police which was established in 1939 to maintain internal security. At that point of time, you would have the intelligence wing of this police force as well. The primary mission of the CRPF is what? Counter-insurgency operations, and also in various areas, in various different states, whenever you have any internal disorder which is present, CRPF is deployed to assist the police forces. So here CRPF also maintains a Cobra battalion in order to particularly target the Maoist insurgents or the left-wing extremist elements which are still present. CRPF also is deployed abroad in the form of global UN peacekeeping missions. So that is where CRPF has got cross-functionality and a multi-purpose utility as well. But then the problem that they face is a significant lack of financing. They don't get adequate finance. Finance for the purchase of proper equipments, finance to standardize the training to the best of the forces of the world, and finance to reorganize the structure to make it operationally more lethal in its effect. Lack of tactical supremacy. So, because people are so overstretched in their work, many of the time people go on for many years or many months in a way without any leave for a single day. While everyone accepts that life in armed forces are tough, but still, if you observe the paramilitary forces, in the past 12 to 24 months, there have been hundreds of cases of suicide. Imagine an armed forces or the morale of the forces where people, they don't feel mentally fit or they don't feel fit enough to represent their country. So that is something which we have to take a look into. And that is why the government has also formed a committee to look into the conditions of working environment that the paramilitary forces, they are put through. There are administrative issues. For example, I gave you the case of Assam Rifles. The administrative control is with the Ministry of Home Affairs, whereas the operational control is with the Ministry of Defense. So always there is so much of bureaucracy involved that if you want to gain a kind of a sharper lethal output, thereby there are a lot of hindrances in the way. So even for procuring weapons, let alone weapons, even for procuring the basic items such as helmets, Kevlars, and so on, you have to go through multiple bureaucratic hurdles. And after that, maybe after 10 to 15 years, these troops are able to get the required funding, the required facilities. Then, overstretched work schedules because the deployment is so significant, and inadequate facilities for the personnel themselves and the families. Now here, the entire debate has been raging because many of the family members of the Pulwama martyrs, they staged a dharna in various parts of the country where they have been demanding a reinstation of the old pension scheme. And they have been demanding few of the basic necessities and jobs, government jobs, etc. And they have been demanding the tweaks in the norms that the government makes to provide jobs and so on. So that is where, if you have the families of the martyrs, if they are forced to come out on the street, it is high time that we give a serious rethink about how these armed forces have the morale, or what is the standard of morale that they have. Then, what is it that we should do moving forward? First of all, the command structure has to be revamped. For example, if you take the case of CRPF or let's say CISF, while for the operational purposes, the troops on the ground, you will find that most of them, they have been trained, inducted thereby, but the head of that is a personnel from Indian Police Service. Now, that should be homegrown ideally, and various different committees have suggested it. Many committees have suggested it that inculcate a homegrown talent, in the sense that a personnel who has joined that CISF at an early age should have the facility to rise up the ranks to head that organization. But then the logic behind putting IPS officers is to ensure cross-operability and cross-functionality at the same time. Specialized task assignments that you dictate and dedicate that, okay, if the national security guards are there, they will be deployed only for a certain purpose. For a large part, this has been rectified. Make no mistake here. At the time when the terrorists landed on the coast of Mumbai and they wreaked havoc in Mumbai for 3 straight days, at that point of time, it took close to around 12 hours to 14 hours for the national security guards to be deployed. And at that point of time, national security guards would be used for private, for the security for the ministers, security for government officials, and so on. So that is something which has been trimmed. And that is something which has been streamlined, but more needs to be done. There has to be a greater synergy with armed forces in terms of equipments, in terms of training, in terms of deployments or postings. You cannot have your armed forces acting in silos or separation. You need to have a perfect coordination, and there is a need to revamp the working conditions. Historically, let alone the modern militaries and the modern armies, if you flip back the pages of history and if you take a look even 2,000 years ago, you will always find that the military victory is always determined by how satisfied the individual soldier is. That determines the morale of the forces, and that determines the outcome of a conflict in majority of the cases. So that is something we have to ensure moving forward. Now, then we come across another piece of article which has appeared. It is a kind of a follow-up story to something which has been appearing in the newspaper for the past couple of days with regards to economy. And this is something, again, in the page of editorial, that is page 8, related to paper 3, that is your economy portion. So this article talks about the fact that how India's export has reduced. And in the past 5 months, this is the 3rd time that the export has reduced in terms of the value, if you will observe, from the last or the same month last year. So this data which is released is of February 2023, where the exports have reduced by close to around roughly 8.8%. Now, in the past 5 months itself, there have been 3 instances of a reduction in export figures. In October, the reduction was close to a whopping 11%. In December, around 3%. And again in February, there has been a decline by close to around 8.5% and more. So that is what this article talks about. So India's goods exports fell for the 3rd time in 5 months in February, following 11.6% drop in October. 3% fall in December, and overall the exports in February, they fell by 8.8% to around $33.9 billion, whereas imports also fell 8.2%. So that is a point of concern. If only export was weakening, you would have always blamed the global scenario, which is still to blame, with regards to why your export is failing, but the imports are also falling. So there is something larger that we need to look at, and a larger possibility of an economic slowdown which can confront us. So for the first 11 months of the year 22-23, India's total exports have surpassed $400 billion already, which is around 8% or 7.5% higher as compared to the previous year. In the same duration, the imports have grown 18.82% to around $653 billion from the earlier figure, which was close to around $550 billion in the previous year. It has increased to close to around $650 billion. So you can imagine the state of the widening deficit that we are staring at. So that is again something that the policymakers need to look at. So here is the chart which depicts to you, or which gives you an information with regards to the export data. You would observe that as compared to now, the green bar represents the FY 2023 and the yellow one represents the financial year 2022. So you can observe that in the year or in the month of February 22, as you compare it to February 2023, this year the exports have reduced, and that is something which is never good. So here it is not as bad as is the case that was observed in October, but nonetheless, overall, as you compare it, there is a declining trend. Obviously, the argument can be made that, look, year on year, last year we had grown significantly, so obviously the export growth, the economic growth, everything is supposed to taper down because of the base effect, because our base is already so high for the last year. But nonetheless, you have certain sectors which are declining, or where the decrease is at an alarming rate. Now, here, if you want to take a look at the overall trade basket of what constitutes the major exports and major imports by India, you would observe that engineering goods amongst the exports. If you take a look at exports only. So amongst the exports, the engineering goods, they occupy a majority in terms of around $111 billion worth of exports, followed by petroleum products. These are mostly refined, right? Crude oil. So that is again something which is exported. Polished gems and jewelries, and organic and inorganic chemicals, all of them, they form the export basket. Whereas the imports, you have huge amount of petroleum and crude which is imported, along with electronic goods, gold and machinery. So overall, when we say that the export is dipping, that is where our engineering goods which we were exporting, that share is coming down at an incredibly fast rate. Now, if we are unable to export engineering goods, what does that tell us? That why that is happening? That is because the world is slowing down. The entire globe and the world is slowing down, as a result of which there is lesser demand for these engineering goods. And also, overall, as the price of crude starts falling, crude oil as it starts falling, in the recent days, the price of the Brent crude oil, that has fallen. So as this price fall happens, you will come across a scenario where the refined crude that we were selling, the value of it also might get impacted. Even though the volume might not, but value might get impacted. Now, whenever there is an export slowdown, there is a direct impact on the domestic economy as well. While this is being led by the global slowdown, the overall uncertainty and fears of recession which prevail and loom large in areas of North America and in areas of Europe, but the impact will be felt significantly on the domestic region as well. How? So, when your exports come down, try to understand this aspect. So, when the exports come down, mean what? we will have lesser production, right? Because let's assume I was exporting this pen. Now, I'm not exporting this pen because nobody is demanding or nobody has got a demand for this pen abroad. So I'm not exporting this anymore. So automatically, there will be a lesser production which will be brought about. And when you have lesser production which is involved, which is present, as a result of that, you will have lesser or less utilization of factories and industries. That is where they are consistently functioning at a utilization rate of around 70%, which was present during 2020-21. That utilization rate is somewhere around 73% now. So while it has improved slightly, but overall, with the decline in exports, these factories will be running at lesser capacity. When they are running at lesser capacity means what? They will need lesser people. So that will lead to unemployment. With unemployment, you have loss of income, which is present. Loss of income, which happens. Now, if suppose I as an individual was working at a factory and I was earning some money. Now, while I was earning some money, I could buy maybe a table fan, maybe a TV, or maybe a motorcycle, and so on. So I was creating demand in the economy. Now when I'm unemployed, obviously I won't be able to buy those stuff anymore. So as a result of that, there will be reduction in demand. So the demand of goods, that reduces. Demand reduces. And when the demand of a particular good, let's say air conditioner, when the demand of a good reduces, then what will happen? The factories who are producing air conditioners, they will start producing less. And again, this entire cycle is initiated. And this is a vicious cycle which an economy can get trapped in for a very long time, where lower production leads to joblessness, leads to less demand, further fuels lower production, and this is where an economy can take years to come out of. So that is something we have to watch out for, that this should not happen. So what is it that we should do moving ahead in order to take care of our exports? So the way forward, first of all, we need to provide some sector-specific incentives. In a scenario where the entire world is reeling under huge amount of pressure for prices, etc., many of the products, they have simply gone out of demand, and simply the prices that we are offering for those products, they are uncompetitive. So we need to have sector-specific approaches which we should develop, we have to develop. Then exploring non-traditional markets. Our traditional markets, for example, the North Americas, the Europe, we have to diversify from that. If you take a look at the growth story of China through the 80s and the 90s, one of the important DNA of that growth story had been a consistent search for newer markets. They would search the smallest of the smallest markets in order to put in their goods so that there is more production in China. And based on that, they have fueled their export-oriented economy. So we need to be able to explore more markets. And that will happen once we make our goods more price competitive. And for that, we need lower taxes and lower tariffs that other countries, they impose on us. For example, take the case of a country like Germany, let's suppose. And Germany wants to import a particular material from a country, Vietnam, and India is also interested in selling that product to Germany. Both of them are interested. Now, in the case of Vietnam, Germany has entered a kind of a free trade agreement, let's suppose, and thereby the rate of tariffs or the rate of taxes here, let's say, is 0.1%. But in the case of India, because you don't have that agreement, the taxes or the tariffs that Germany will impose might be around 5%. So, for every good that is produced, let's say we produce a particular good which has a value of rupees 100. Let's suppose Vietnam also manages to produce a good which has a value of rupees 100. Now, overall, for a German customer who is buying these goods, what will be the cost? The cost will be, Indian good will be priced at 105, whereas the Vietnamese good will be priced still at around 100. So what would they prefer? Would they ever prefer to buy costlier good? Absolutely not. So because of this, in many of the cases, due to lack of the free trade agreements, we face significant disadvantages from countries such as Vietnam, from countries such as South Korea, from countries such as Cambodia, and that is where even our traditional markets, we are eking out the space in those traditional markets to these players. So that is where India has to significantly reinvigorate its effort to ink the deal with regards to the free trade agreement with various nations. Yes, the negotiations are on with the case of United Kingdom, with the case of European Union, but significant more steps need to be taken. You need to analyze that where or these countries are getting the goods from which particular region and what is the competitive advantage that you have. That pinpointed focus needs to be done so that we are able to avoid an overcoming economic slowdown. Okay? Then we move to the last major topic of the day, that is overcoming a century of difficult ties. And before that, a question by Kishan Gupta. Step taken by government against economic direction or cycle to counter this vicious cycle. That is where the government can take step, whereas it can incentivize certain industries so that by lowering the tax tariff, etc. on certain industries which are impacted by this, they can ensure that these industries are not forced to fire people immediately. As a result of that, there is no loss of income, there is no loss of demand which happens, and also there is a kind of a refurbishment of various different tariffs imposed for getting the raw materials and taxes which are meted out. So that can be done. Now, then coming to the last major topic, that is overcoming a century of difficult ties. Japan and South Korea renew ties at Tokyo summit. And this is something which is monumental. In the coming week, you will hear much more about this particular story developing. This is where South Korea and Japan have shed away their traditional long-lasting hostility. These countries have been hostile to each other. Even though both of them, they share a larger strategic goal, but still they have been distinctly hostile. Not many of us, we are aware about the process or the entire aspect of hostility. So we will talk about it very briefly, but before that, the context. So the leaders of South Korea and Japan promised to resume ties in a fence-mending summit, the first such meeting in 12 years, and thereby the two neighbors seek to confront threats from the rising issues of the threats imposed by China and North Korea. Now, both the leaders, they have basically agreed to visit each other countries more frequently, have more ministerial delegations visit each other country, and that is something where the term shuttle diplomacy has been coined. This is a term which has been coined, that is shuttle diplomacy, where you move very frequently from one region to another. So a quick look at the historical background of these ties. So here you will observe that this is, by the way, a rough map indicating this is the portion of North Korea, and this is South Korea. And that is where you have DPRK, that is Democratic People's Republic of Korea, that is the name for North Korea which is associated, and Republic of Korea, which we in common lingo refer to as South Korea. The capital of North Korea, Pyongyang, and the capital of South Korea, Seoul. Now, Japan took control of Korea and the Korean peninsula with the Japan-Korea Annexation Treaty of 1910. Now, at that point of time, Japan took control. Now, in 1945, that is after World War II, and at the end of World War II, Japan suffered quite significantly. Japan suffered huge loss. Now, at that point of time, who was a major victor in the region? Who won? It was Russia or the erstwhile Soviet Union. So Soviet Union, that started taking control of the entire region, which was earlier controlled by Japan. And thereby, Soviet Union extended its control all the way across the region of the Korean peninsula, almost up till the region of the North Korean boundary. Then, US-based forces, they took control of the southern part of the Korean peninsula, that is the South Korea that we refer to. Both of these borders, they are separated by what we refer to as the 38th parallel. They are separated by 38th parallel. So what is 38th parallel? It is that latitude which passes through the region around which the bordering area exists. So this again can be a trivia for your prelims, that 38th parallel ends up dividing which two countries? So North and South Korea. So there have been instances where, for example, United States and the forces, they managed to take control of the entire territory of the Korean peninsula, and that was followed by the Chinese aggression, where then they managed to ouster the entire other forces from the Korean peninsula. So there was a lot of conflict in the entire era of the Korean War, which followed the World War II. You had an armistice agreement which was arrived at in 1953. And peace has prevailed since the agreement of 1953. But then, there was still a lot of hostility, and there is still a lot of hostility which is present. Because during the Japanese occupation since 1910 onwards, there had been various different atrocities which had been meted out to the local population. And the huge amount of economic losses that they suffered, the people of South Korea, they demanded economic reparations for the same. So they put that condition that first of all, you apologize to us. That was a straightforward condition. You have to apologize to us, say sorry. Secondly, provide compensation for the losses that we have suffered. Thirdly, provide us economic loans and incentives at a cheaper rate so that we can stand back on our feet. So in order to summarize all these demands, you had the Treaty on Basic Relations between Japan and South Korea in 1965, which is also famously referred to as the 1965 Accord. So since that point of time, largely there was an understanding, an agreement, and Japan had apologized. To be fair to Japan, Japan during this time and after this time also has maintained its stance that we are ready to apologize for the mistakes that has happened. And as a result of that, Japan has provided various different loans on a very easy rates and almost at a free rate as well for many of the Korean companies which have benefited since that point of time. Now, why is it that Korea demanded such kind of an economic reparation as well as justice for the people? Because the Korean allegation has been very simple that, look, because of the atrocities that our people faced, many of your companies, they blossomed, they flourished, and they became the giants. For example, Nippon Steel, something that we all are aware of. For example, Mitsubishi Heavy Engineering, again something we are all aware of. From shipbuilding to vehicles, everywhere they have their presence. All of them, they grew based upon the forced labors that was carried out from these Koreans. So that is where they had that demand. Now, since 1965, after the provision of easy loans, you also had the rise of Korean giants. For example, you have the POSCO Steel. right? So you have such various examples where the Korean giants have also risen up. Now recently, you had another case which was filed in one of the courts, and basically, due to that, the court decided to give justice to those people. The appellants for that case were those people who were forced to do an atrocious, laborious job during that Japanese colonial period. And that is where the court said that you should be given a kind of an economic remuneration and a reparation for that. And after that, Japan simply said that, look, whatever we had to provide, we did provide. Now, start providing for your own. So this was a major point of contention which remained for a long time. It was in the past week, you could see the murmurings happening last week itself, where the Korean leaders, they decided to set up a committee, a kind of an NGO of sorts, a foundation of sorts, which would be set up in Korea, where the public would put in money, and that money would be utilized to pay the victims of that era. So that is when the path for peace has been laid down, and Japanese leaders, they welcomed it. So the issues which still are present amongst the larger populace you will find is Japan's colonial atrocities that has not been forgotten in the common mindset and the accumulated conscience of the society in South Korea. Forced labor and sex slaves, many of them, they are still suffering, even though most of them are in their 90s, but they are still suffering. And that is what has generated a kind of a generational grievance, which persists from one generation to the other. But there are certain necessities due to which the countries have decided to come together. For example, the geopolitical environment is changing like anything. As these leaders were in fact meeting, at that point of time, hilariously, North Korea decided to launch a missile. And North Korea has been doing that for some time. You have hostile China, you have hostile North Korea. So that is why Japan and South Korea, and interestingly, both of them, they are natural allies of United States. United States Army trains with South Korean Army, trains with Japanese Army. But then both these armed forces, they don't look eye to eye. Then you have a strategic convergence in terms of long-term goals as well. So because of this, the countries have come together. But then when we look forward, owing to the geopolitical realities, you can predict a kind of a situation where there will be much closer cooperation in the light of the new emergent dangers, for example, aggressive Russia, aggressive China, aggressive North Korea. So that is why the obvious path is the path of peace. Now, then we come across few of the stories which are relevant for your prelims examination. So here, National Institute of Ocean Tech, that has established or set up a green self-powered desalination plant in Lakshadweep. What is a desalination plant? A desalination plant is something which removes salt from seawater and makes it potable, that it makes it fit for drinking purposes. That is desalination. So in areas such as Lakshadweep, the supply of drinking water obviously cannot be carried from the mainland. You have a lot of seawater around. So if you have proper desalination facilities, that is something which will benefit. Now here you have to observe that what is NIOT? NIOT is an autonomous body under the Ministry of Earth Sciences. And another aspect that you have to look at from the prelims perspective is the technology which is used. That is the low temperature thermal desalination. Temperature thermal desalination. Now, what is done in this? Very briefly, if we talk about how it is carried out. So here, you have the surface water which is warmer and the water which is present at a depth of maybe 60 feet or more, which is significantly colder. Now, that warm water, that is basically put under very low pressure, due to which it starts to vaporize. Now, when that warm water will start to vaporize, that is when it is brought into contact with the cold water coming from underneath. And because of that cold water, the vapor, what will happen to the vapor? It will start to condense. And when it condenses, obviously it will be pure water. All the salt shall be left behind during the process of evaporation as well. So that is where it is the thermal desalination. So surface water, which is warmer, and water present at 60 meters, 60 feet depth, which is significantly colder, they are treated and the temperature is exchanged. Then you have another article which is relevant for your prelims, that is Exercise Sea Dragon 2023. So this is being held in Guam. Where is Guam? Guam is to the west, to the eastern part of Philippines in the Pacific Ocean. That is where you have Guam. Where is it held? It is held in Guam. So this exercise actually has witnessed representation by Indian Navy. So for your prelims perspective, you need to know the participants. So you have India, you have United States, you have Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Forces, you have the Royal Canadian Air Force, and you have the Republic of Korea. This is South Korea. So if a question is asked that exercise Sea Dragon was conducted with which different powers, you have the answer. Then another article here, that is Border Road Organization opens up strategic Zojila Pass in record 68 days. So Zojila Pass, that is present where? In the Kargil district. And this is the Zojila Pass which provides a connectivity between Srinagar to Leh and Ladakh. So that is why this Zojila Pass is very, very strategically important for us, because it helps us ensure the availability of supplies, rations, materials, ammunitions, men, personnel, everything across the now very active line of actual control with China. So that is why the Zojila Pass needs to be operational. Historically, if you take a look back at it, that is 2 years back, this Zojila Pass, it used to, every year, by the way, it is closed during the winter. So 2 years back, it used to take close to around 170 days to clear them up. Now, it is being cleared in record 68 days. It is across this pass that you have the very strategic construction which is happening of the Zojila Tunnel. Once that Zojila Tunnel, now the basic civil works are done, where the tunnel has been dug out. Now there are mechanical, electrical, engineering works which are left. Now there, this Zojila Tunnel, once it becomes operational, it will be able to provide all-weather connectivity from the region of Srinagar to the region of Leh and Ladakh, thereby providing us with a kind of a strategic depth which is very much required in the face of aggressive China. So you need to know about Zojila, providing connectivity to Srinagar to Leh. Where is it situated? Kargil district. Very close to Dras, one of the coldest regions in India, by the way, Dras. So very close to Dras is where you will find the presence of Zojila Pass. Okay? Now, that is for the discussions for the day. Now we'll take a couple of questions here. So the type of mains type of questions which can be asked from here. So discuss the impact of colonial rule which has been left behind on the socio-political setup and the governance in the subcontinent. So for this, you can write an answer for 250 words, 15 marks. Now, in the introduction part, I would always advise you that very briefly in one sentence, try to write about what do you mean by colonialism, give certain examples of colonial powers, and then in the end sentence of introduction, you can always write that this has created deep-rooted impacts on many countries felt even today. And that provides a flow to the body. That is when you start the body of the answer. You start writing about what kinds of impacts, the social impact, the political impact, the governance impact, impact on economy, impact on inequality, all these factors you can count out, you can write it down, and eventually while concluding, try to conclude it with a positive frame of mind, even though it is very difficult for these kinds of questions where traditionally you would want to criticize everything, but try to conclude it that at the same time, this colonial experience has further managed to strengthen the national will in many of these countries, and that is where you observe many of the success stories which have been brought about and lasting stories which shall be created moving ahead. So such kind of a positive aspect you can always provide. Now discuss the reasons and the impact of the current trend of trade deficit in India. This is for 10 marks, 150 words that you can write. And there directly start with what do you mean by trade deficit? Start talking about that yes, there is a decline in exports, there is a decline in imports by the way as well, which can signal an overall decline in demand in the economy, which can signal an overall demand in the economic growth story of the country. But then why is it that exports are decreasing? Global slowdown. Why is it that imports are decreasing? In many of the cases, Atmanirbharta is coming. In many of the cases, we are replacing the import items. And in many of the cases, there is a simple drop in price and demand. So all those factors you write, you try to draw that vicious cycle if you can, if you want to. That will make your answer very representative. So that is all from my side. That is where we will end the session for the day. I hope that this session has been meaningful for all of you. Now, after this, I would suggest to you, kindly do check your level of assessment or assess yourself with regards to how much you have understood for these topics. Go to the Telegram channel. The description you will find in the link below. And thereby, after going there, try to check out how many questions, multiple choice questions, you can get it correct. Leave that answer in our comment section, and if you like the video, please don't forget to click on like, share and subscribe, and tell us about the content of the video as well. So that shall be all. Thank you. Take care of yourself. Goodbye.